Thank you all for coming to IISS America's office today to join us in this discussion meeting with His Excellency David O'Sullivan, Ambassador of the European Union to the United States. This event is part of our Ambassadors Forum series, which brings leading diplomats to engage with IISS members and the general public on pressing issues of the day. And there are many pressing issues of the day involving the European Union and the United States. I might start with Brexit, which is UK and the European Union, but has a lot of interest for Americans as well. The Iran deal, of which the European Union was one of the 8 parties to negotiate the deal, and the party principally leading the negotiations. The issue of European security in the context of Russian aggression and what the U.S. policy may turn out to be in this regard is high on the agenda. So I expect Ambassador O'Sullivan will touch on these issues, if not in his prepared remarks, in the Q&A, but also transnational issues that are very relevant for an organization like the European Union, as well as the United States. Issues like data privacy, climate change mitigation, counterterrorism, and the migration issues that are impacting European societies and security so much. Just by a quick introduction, Ambassador O'Sullivan has been in his post in Washington since November 2014. Before that, he was the Chief Operating Officer of the European External Action Service. That's the European Diplomatic Service, and he was responsible for setting up that service. A huge job, and I've seen it in action. I deal with diplomats from the European Union, and it's very interesting to see how that all has turned out, and very well, I might say. He's been an EU public civil servant since 1979, same year that I became a U.S. diplomat years ago. And from his name and his accent, I'll let you surmise his nationality. So we will be here for an hour. I'll ask the ambassador to speak from the podium for about 20 minutes, and then we'll engage in Q&A. So, Ambassador O'Sullivan, over to you, please.
Thank you. Well, Mark, thank you very much indeed for your invitation to speak. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here. I'm here not just as an ambassador, but actually as a friend and neighbor. Our offices are just about 200 feet across, and my office is about 100 feet up. The Starbucks on the corner is the point of reference. But I hope that doesn't constitute product placement since we're being live streamed. But I'll see if I get an extra latte on my app as a result of that reference. But anyway, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm also very pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you about the transatlantic relations at what we must admit is an interesting time on both sides of the Atlantic. And I'm very pleased also because in fact, I was in Brussels very briefly, just got back last night. I was there on Monday because we had some very important meetings with Vice President Pence. And we have actually had a fairly good sequence of meetings between the European Union and the new administration. 10 days ago, we had Commissioner Avramopoulos, responsible for Home Affairs and Migration, to discuss cooperation on counterterrorism and migration with Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly and High Representative Vice President Federica Mogherini. We do great titles. I mean, my own title, Chief Operating Officer of the European External Action Service, is one that I will treasure all my life. And Federica Mogherini, who has the title High Representative Vice President, I like to use the shorthand Secretary of State, but which I think better catches the concept, was here to meet also with many important levels of the administration, with, well, the first foreign leaders to meet with the U.S. Secretary of State, Mr. Tillerson, special advisors to the President, and an impressive number of senators, including the chairs of Senate Foreign Affairs, Armed Services, and Homeland Security committees. And last week, she met with Mr. Tillerson again at the G20 ministerial in Bonn, and attended the NATO ministerial in Brussels with Defense Secretary Mattis. And of course, there was the speed dating of the Munich Security Conference, when there were a wide range of contact between a very important delegation of both the administration and of Congress in Munich, with a large number of European leaders, including the European Union institutions. And on Monday, we were very pleased that Vice President as part of his visit to Europe, met with the European leaders in Brussels. He met again with Ms. Mogherini, but with President Tusk of the European Council, and there was a joint press conference where he underlined the importance of the partnership between the United States and the European Union, and also with President Juncker, the President of the European Commission. So we're very grateful to be able to engage with the new administration at this early stage, while the newly inaugurated president and his teams are defining U.S. policies for the future. And we know that this is a process which is going to take some time. Not all of the president's choices for cabinet have been confirmed and are in position. And as I'm learning, transitions in administration in D.C. take time. There are variously, people tell me, 4,000 to 5,000 senior positions that need to be, appointments that need to be made. And so people are constantly reminding us that the full rollout of the policies of this new administration is going to take many months. And we need to be patient, and we are certainly listening and trying to understand the direction in which the new administration is going to go, particularly as regards transatlantic relations. There's a lot in common between us. There are many areas where Europe and the United States approach the challenges we face shoulder to shoulder and eye to eye. There may be times when we will have some disagreements, but there is space, in my view, where common ground for understanding and common action can grow. This forum today, the meetings which we've been having, and other meetings which will continue. There's going to be a very important G7 meeting in Taormina under the Italian presidency. The German presidency of the G20 in Hamburg in July will be another important opportunity. And I think it's very important at this point in the putting in place of a new administration that we have the fullest dialogue, not only between the European institutions, but also with our member states. Our relationship has been built up over a century of joint history, which include a number of anniversaries this year, which remind us acutely not only of how close Europe and the United States have become, but also our reliance on each other for the future. Let me just highlight one or two of these. 2017 marks the 100th anniversary of the United States entering the First World War, a war of nations between our continent, our first European civil war of the 20th century. A war of attrition and stalemate, and frankly of senseless loss of life. The war that many believed would end all wars. Well, we know where that got us. And 25 years later, U.S. troops crossed the Atlantic once again during the Second World War. And I want to say here that we're constantly aware of the sacrifice of your servicemen and women who gave their lives in these two world wars to help free the European continent. And the way in which the United States stood with us in the aftermath of World War II to help us reconstruct our continent will never be forgotten by the people of Europe. And that brings me to the second anniversary, which is the 70th anniversary of the speech General George Marshall gave, which launched the Marshall Plan, the first beginnings of designing what I like to call a new business model for Europe. After the experience of two civil wars, which turned into world wars, and the Holocaust, we felt we desperately had to find a new way of relating to each other on the continent of Europe. And this was based on two very simple principles which General Marshall set out in his speech. First, the idea that Europeans should take the initiative and the ownership of finding a new way of working and living together on the European continent. But second, that the United States would stand willing to underpin and support these efforts, both politically and, in the case of the Marshall Plan, financially. And that plan served to foster and reinvigorate our joint values and interests and establish the peace and prosperity that we have seen in subsequent decades. The third anniversary this year is the 60th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Rome, which followed logically the structures that were put in place to deliver the Marshall Plan and took Europeans on the first step of finding a new architecture for living and working together on the European continent. The European Economic Community, which was created by the Treaty of Rome, laid the foundation for what we now know and what has become the European Union. And for what was once a divided continent, Europe has morphed not only into the largest and wealthiest single market in the world, but at the same time a beacon for stability, prosperity, and I believe very profoundly a force for good in the world. The European Union is not just a successful economic trading bloc, but truly a union of common values, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, which we share with the United States. It is also, if I may be allowed a personal remark, it is a uniquely European way of reconciling our desire to maintain our individual identities, our individual nationalities, our language, our culture, with working together and no longer going to war over our differences. And this has been the unique achievement of the European Union in providing an overarching structure in which we can cooperate, in which we can solve our problems through boring meetings and arguments in conference rooms rather than in trenches or in fighting. And this is very, very important. I have 28 member state ambassadors, some of whom are here present today, who represent their national interests in Washington. The European Union is not about obliterating the nation state or not about obliterating the identity of our member states. It is how we can better achieve our national objectives without the excesses of nationalism through cooperation and through working together. And this, in my view, is the unique achievement of the European Union. Perhaps not always easy for Americans to understand. Your motto is E pluribus unum. You are trying to build one out of diversity. Our issue in Europe is how to manage diversity, and our motto is unity in diversity, because we do not wish to give up our individual identities, our cultures, our sense of history of our countries. At the same time, we know we have to work together to solve joint problems on the continent and globally. And from the 6 original founding members in 1958, through various enlargements, accession to the European Union has been a very important beacon for many countries, particularly those emerging from authoritarian systems. And most recently, the enlargement of the 21st century, which reunited the country and brought into the European Union the countries of the former Soviet Union from behind the Iron Curtain, living up to the promise of George H.W. Bush, who in 1989, at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, spoke of his hope for a Europe whole and free, and I believe that we have been able to build that. I do not believe that the European Union can claim credit for the collapse of the Berlin Wall, but I do think we can claim credit for the orderly transition of countries, once subject to oppression, into the thriving European democracies that we see today. Europe will continue to promote international dialogue and cooperation, to play its global role in full, at a moment when our global partners increasingly look to us to work together on the basis of our shared principles and values. Our alliance places a duty on us to preserve the legacy of peace and stability in Europe that benefits all. A strong United States also means a strong Europe, and vice versa. We need to protect, empower, and defend our citizens, working together to face the threat of terrorism or the growing concerns of the social impact of globalization. It is not only Europe depends on the United States, but the United States is tied into and dependent on the success of a strong Europe. There is much talk today in the United States, which I understand, about jobs and growth, about economic progress, or the net surplus or deficit of various trade relationships. I want to emphasize today that 80% of United States foreign direct investment in this country comes from the European Union. We create, roughly speaking, 15 million jobs transatlantically through our respective trade and investment. In fact, in 2015, Europe invested twice as much into the United States than the US invests in Europe. Together, we represent around 50% of global GDP or 30% of world trade. We share high standards and a common objective to reconcile economic progress with social progress. But our economic and trade relationship is extremely balanced, and we contribute enormously to each other's prosperity. Our relationship, of course, is not just about trade and commerce. It's also a strategic alliance. We are essential partners, and that is one of the reasons why I'm very pleased to be here in the IISS. Our foreign policy, security and defense is built not only around the relationship of cooperation we have fostered with NATO and intensified over the last year, but based also on our own efforts providing security and stability around the world. We currently have about 15 ongoing European Union civilian and military missions at present. I just mentioned one. We have virtually eradicated piracy off the Gulf of Somalia, largely due to a very major European naval operation, which has been extremely successful. The solidarity of Europe and the United States has been demonstrated time and time again, like the conflict to free Afghanistan, where many European nations have sent troops to the front or provided military support. The European Union itself has been running over the last 10 years a major policing mission in Afghanistan. Europe is the United States' closest ally in the coalition's efforts against ISIL. Our member states represent 40% of coalition members. And the European Union itself leads on countering ISIL propaganda, supports the clearing of landmines in Iraq, and is also the main humanitarian donor both in Iraq and Syria. And last week we presented our vision for the future of Syria once we have achieved a stable peace and a political process at the G20 ministerial. The rebuilding of Syria is going to be a massive task for the international community, and the European Union is going to do all it can to mobilize the resources and the cooperation needed to help Syria rebuild once we find a political solution. We're also willing and ready to do more to reinforce the role of the European Union as a security provider. We've taken bigger steps over recent months to increase our defense capabilities and move towards strategic autonomy. We are delivering on the European Union global strategy set out by High Representative Mogherini, and we will continue to increase our efforts. So we do, in many ways, pay more than our fair share, as do Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, when it comes to dealing with the consequences of these conflicts. I'm referring to the heavy flows of migrants and refugees towards Europe, coming mainly from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. We have welcomed millions of asylum seekers and migrants in the past years, and we will keep respecting our commitments to non-discriminatory international protection of people fleeing conflict and persecution. This is a very important commitment that we entered into globally in 1951, bearing in mind, let us not forget, the horrific experience of the 30s when the international community let down the Jewish people seeking to flee from persecution in continental Europe. And we promised that we would never again allow a similar situation to develop. While we in Europe are not as shy as some like to think when it comes to hard power and conflict management, we also believe we need to address the roots of those conflicts and support our neighbours in creating a more sustainable environment for its people. We run development programs very similar to the Marshall Plan, like our pre-accession instrument and our European Neighbourhood Instrument. The work we are doing in the Western Balkans, who have a clear perspective of membership of the European Union, is a very, very important process in helping those countries reconcile their historic differences and have a common path towards a membership of the European Union based on the values underpinning that union. So this is another way in which we contribute to the stability and security of the continent. We are, of course, dealing with an unprecedented level of terrorist threat, as we have seen tragically in recent years. We are working at full speed to set up a security union that will effectively better protect our external border and make Europe safer. We now have additional boots on the ground from the European Union's Border and Coast Guard, which was set up to deal with this new crisis, and Europol, the European Police Agency, which acts as the coordination for our intelligence efforts. And we are working very hard in Italy, Bulgaria, and Greece. We are now running much more systematic ID checks, including on the Greek islands, and entering them into the Schengen Information System, which is a database which enables that information to be made available to all the law enforcement agencies in Europe. European and US law enforcement authorities, particularly through Europol and the FBI, collaborate closely at home to prevent terrorist attacks on both sides of the Atlantic. And I know that close collaboration has probably prevented many attacks, which fortunately we've never had to hear of, even as we speak. The European Union, in the form of Vice High Representative Federica Mogherini, is the chair of the JCPOA that oversees the implementation of the Iran deal, which you mentioned, Mark. And she is determined, and reiterated that when she was here, to make sure that all parties respect their commitments. And we were reassured by continued US support of the Iran deal, which was confirmed to her in our many meetings. This does not mean that we do not share US concerns on the role of Iran in regional conflicts, links with terrorist groups, missile tests, or infringement of human rights. The nuclear deal was intended to do one thing and one thing alone, which was to put nuclear weapons beyond Iran's capability for the foreseeable future. It did not solve all our other problems with Iran, and we will continue to address those. We in Europe have sanctions in place for non-nuclear related issues with Iran, and in some cases our sanctions, we believe, are even tougher than some of the American ones. When it comes to Russia, I think, and people talk a lot about relations with Russia these days, but I think actually there's a great commonality of view, which is that we need a two-track approach with Russia. There are files on which we work together with Russia. The Iran deal is one, or the Middle East peace process is another. And the idea that we in Europe do not wish to engage with Russia is a misconception. But on the other hand, we have to be firm in pushing back on Russia's behavior when we believe it is unacceptable, such as what has happened in Ukraine. One of the fundamental principles of the Helsinki peace process, which tried to bring an end to the Cold War in Europe, was the fundamental principle that you do not change borders by force. And the seizure of Crimea was, in our view, a breach of that fundamental principle. And we will maintain sanctions against Russia for as long as the Minsk agreements are not fully implemented. And I know that the US Congress defends a very similar position. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have been the backbone of the international rules-based order since World War II together. We largely shaped that order. It is, of course, an order which is under stress and strain. There are new actors emerging, new emerging countries, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and we have to make place for these new actors in this order. But at the same time, we have to recognize the enormous value which this order gave us. Whether it's the United Nations, the Bretton Woods system, or the World Trade Organization, these organizations provided a remarkable backdrop against which we could try to manage the challenging international environment. And this is something to which we as Europeans are very committed. We don't ignore the importance of hard power, but we also understand the importance of a rule of law and an international system based on common understandings of how countries can and should behave. And this is something which we share greatly with the United States. I look forward to working with this new administration on this agenda as we go forward. There are many other issues to discuss, as you said, Mark, and I want to stop now because I promised to not speak for longer than 20 minutes. But I just want to say that, firstly, I met someone coming in who said, we're looking forward to your optimistic presentation. And I think I was quoted somewhere recently as quoting Karl Popper, but it's not actually Karl Popper. It's actually another philosopher, but who said that optimism is a moral duty. But I am confident and optimistic that even as we go through very difficult times on both sides of the Atlantic, and you're experiencing a lot of change here, we in Europe face challenges on our side. We have important elections coming up in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany, possibly in Italy. And we know that there are differing views about the direction which our societies could take. But I remain very optimistic that in Europe we will find the right answers to these questions. And I remain very optimistic that at the end of the day, as this administration settles in, the fundamental interests of our relationship will win out. And we will continue to realize on the importance of our close cooperation for the benefit of our own citizens, looked at in a selfish sense, for our joint benefit, but also because we need to work together to address the global problems which we face. The days when agreement between the European Union and the United States was a sufficient condition to move global events are certainly over with the new actors and the changed environment. I continue to believe that it remains the necessary condition for us to find solutions to international problems, that the European Union and the US are on the same page and are working towards the same objectives. And I'm sure that that will continue to be the case. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador O'Sullivan. That was an inspiring presentation. We don't always hear about the mission and the value of unity in diversity. I appreciated your optimism. It's a particular duty of diplomats, I think, to be optimistic. When I was in London, I thought that was the most difficult place for an EU ambassador to serve, particularly after the astounding vote by the Brits to leave the European Union. But being the EU ambassador in Washington has to be, right now, the most difficult position, and particularly when you read news like the one I saw this morning of Reuters piece on just as Vice President Pence was pledging America's steadfast and enduring commitment to the European Union, White House Chief Strategist Steve Bannon met with a German diplomat and delivered a very different message, viewing the EU as a flawed construct and favoring conducting relations with Europe on a bilateral basis. You noted that policies and postures are still evolving, but I wonder how you deal with this kind of situation where some important players don't want to deal with the EU as a unified entity.
Well, I've read those press reports, but I have no personal knowledge of the conversation. I must say I don't actually experience so far any problem relating to this administration as the EU. We have our job, our member states, we have the ambassador of Bulgaria who's here, our member states have their job. I made the point that it's not an either or. We're not saying to the United States, either you deal with the European Union or you deal with our member states. Of course not. We are not a federal structure such as you are. By the way, I also deal with the 50 states, and by the way, when I visit 50 states, I see the enormous diversity of this country, but we are a different legal structure. But on the other hand, there are many things which our member states have decided are better managed at the level of the European Union. Yeah. And by the way, this is a voluntary choice. This is not something that someone in Brussels has kind of twisted their arm and said, oh, you must. We've agreed this because we think we get better results. And let me just give one very simple example because it's kind of economics 101. Why do we say that individual countries cannot have separate trade deals with our trading partners? Because we have an integrated single market. Now, if you have an integrated single market with a single customs tariff around that market, which is a huge benefit for American business, it means when they sell into Europe, they've only got one set of customs regulations, one set of rules to meet, one tariff to meet. When they invest in Europe, once they're invested, they can sell anywhere in the market of 500 million people. The logical consequence of that, pure basic economics, is you need a single trade policy. You do a trade deal between that market and the other trading partner. You can't have separate trade deals or the whole thing would fall apart. If Germany was saying, I'm going to make it's easier for Americans to export to Germany than it is to export to Ireland, but Ireland and Germany are a seamless market, it just doesn't work. Right. So it's just practicalities. It's not ideological. And the member states profoundly believe this. They want us to negotiate as a single entity. And the same is true in many other areas where they have decided that we do these things better at the European level than at the national level. But by the way, the vast bulk of what actually determines the quality of people's lives in our individual countries is still decided at national level. All the important stuff, your education system, your healthcare system, your social welfare system, all of this, your labor market rules. We have some common rules, but basically some labor markets in Europe are very regulated and very structured. Others are very deregulated, and they coexist in the same entity of the European Union.
Thank you very much. That's a great answer. Let me turn to others if there's questions. Catch my eye. Wait for the microphone to come. The gentleman in the third row on the left here. State your name and affiliation, and pose a concise comment or question.
Thanks, Mark. I'm Will Embry from DynCorp International. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for that. I think you so far fulfilled your moral duty. Since the founding of the experiment, there have been forces pulling the union together and pushing it apart. And some of those ones which pulled it together early on, that there will never be another war between Germany and France, for example, are being sort of overcome by some of the centripetal forces going on. I was wondering if you could talk about the balance of those forces now and sort of where you see them going.
Yeah, I mean, we are democracies. And as democracies, there is a plurality of view about the direction forward for our individual countries and our collective direction forward. And frankly, I have never been shocked at the fact that there are people who say, we don't want European integration. I mean, it's a legitimate perspective. I don't share it, but you can have that view, and people should be allowed to express it. And in the case of the United Kingdom, it became the dominant view, and it has therefore changed the direction of that country. So I remain convinced that the arguments in favor of closer European integration, recognizing the importance of what I said, that this is not about demolishing the nation state, it is not about homogenizing Europe into some bland sort of European mix which you don't recognize, but rather about pragmatically delivering better outcomes for our citizens because we do things together. I think that will continue to be the dominant view in our member states, and it's heavily supported by opinion polls and by other outcomes if you look at the voting patterns in most of our member states. But there will always be a healthy debate about how much of this we do, and you're right, probably the reliant on Europe as the most successful peace project ever has gone a little away from people's minds. But to be honest, there have also been some reminders of that. The conflict in the Balkans in the 90s showed us that our past is never too far behind us in Europe. the aggression of Russia showed us that, well, the idea that military force could be used in Europe, unfortunately, is an idea that has not completely gone away. So much though we work towards the notion of nonviolence and of cooperative discussions, we're also reminded that we have a dangerous past. And I'm sometimes surprised when I hear some Americans saying that, we should encourage individual countries to be more nationally assertive. Well, we know where that got us. I don't think we have a deficit of nationalism in Europe. Winston Churchill said of the Balkans that they produce more history than they could consume. I like to adjust that to say the history of Europe shows us that we produced more nationalism than we could consume. And part of the learning process of the three anniversaries I mentioned, the First World War, the Marshall Plan, the Treaty of Rome, was about figuring out a way of containing that nationalism in structures that never spilled over into violent conflict. And I think at the end of the day, people do understand that in Europe. And I think people will continue to commit to this process of unification. But there's a healthy debate, and it must happen. It's a good that there are people in the European Parliament who've been elected to express opposition to more European integration. We need that debate because there are people who are skeptical, who wonder whether this is the best way forward. And we need that debate in an open and transparent way.
Thank you very much. Very good answer. In the second row here, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm Judge Matkovic, Ambassador of Serbia. And Mr. O'Sullivan, thank you very much for your optimistic presentation, really, regarding the EU. The optimism was also mentioned in connection with the Western Balkans. You said that you see a clear path of the Western Balkans to the EU. However, we, from our perspective, see a little bit different picture because we are facing some difficulties opening new chapters, sometimes blocked by some already member states, that the EU has some other problems to solve, like the migrant crisis, the Brexit, the Greek crisis, and there is also this present enlargement fatigue, which is slowing down our accession. We would like to see it more quickly happening, and I was just wondering whether you, despite of these difficulties, you see a clear path for the Balkans. And the other question would be, how do you see the future of the European Union after the elections which are upcoming in Netherlands, France, and Germany? So, if these right-wing forces win and they will advocate the exit of these countries from the EU. Thank you.
To your first question, Ambassador, I think we are very clear. The Western Balkans are the only other part of Europe which has to which there is a clear commitment of future accession. There are other countries in Europe where this debate has yet to take place, but we have a clear commitment to the Western Balkans, and that process is ongoing. And I believe it will be delivered upon. But it is also true that from the perspective of the existing members of the European Union, we want to be sure that we're not importing unresolved problems. So people want to be sure that, firstly, the individual Balkan countries have met the conditions for accession. And this is not just to be difficult, or it's because we know that if countries join the European Union without being ready, it can create problems for them and for us. So that's why we have very strict criteria and very strict conditions which we believe need to be met. And if they're not met, we don't think the accession will be successful, neither for you nor for us. So this is not, in my view, something which can be decided by a calendar. You can't say, well, by the end of next year you will join. No, the answer is you will join when we both feel, your judgment as well, that the conditions are met for a successful accession. The second element is that you have sorted out your internal, your problems between you, and we really feel the need, and that's why we're trying to do all we can to facilitate that. But at the end of the day, it's you have to solve these problems yourself. But you can imagine people do not want to import into the European Union ongoing disputes about borders, about frontiers, about minorities, and so forth. So we need to feel so that's why that's the twin track. So I think the commitment is very firm. But equally, I think people will be vigilant that the two conditions I've mentioned have been met. And I know it's not easy. I know how much countries have gone through to join the European Union at times, and it's a tough process. But I think those countries who've been through that will admit that getting the preparation right is the secret to making a success of it when it happens. And prematurely joining the European Union can actually be a mistake for a country. On the question of the elections, look, I can't predict the outcome of the elections. I can only repeat what I said, I think, in answer to the first question. I think if you look at the opinion polls, there is very, very strong support for the European Union and its objectives, even if there are disagreements about certain aspects of European Union policy. And to a certain extent, Brussels is the place everybody likes to moan about. By the way, I notice people like to moan a lot about Washington when I travel around. I sometimes say that Brussels is held in as much self-esteem, in as much esteem in the rest of Europe as Washington seems to be held in the rest of the United States. I mean, I think it's natural that the place where the centralized decisions get taken is not always viewed with great popularity by everyone. But having said that, I continue to think that people in Europe do understand why we need the European Union. And it was said of NATO that if it didn't exist, it would be necessary to invent it. I believe the same is true of the European Union. If it didn't exist, it would be necessary to invent it. And therefore, I hope that we're not going to disinvent something that we would then need to reinvent. And I'm fairly confident that whatever the outcome of the precise outcome of these different elections, that will continue to be the case.
Thanks very much. You're giving me good material for tweeting afterwards.
People tell me I always worry about that. Yes.
Ms. Che here in the third row.
Ambassador, my name is Hanjin Choi, Langham Partners, and thank you so much, lucid and succinct and witty remark. My question is with regard to the unity and diversity with UK. Very simple question. How would you deal with the $60 billion Brexit deals? And some people criticize Prime Minister Cameron for not leaving any message to his successor, Prime Minister May, Euro equivalent of Liam Bond's message. There is no money left. The question is, my understanding there are 3 potential obligations by UK government: A, dealing with the budget issues, with in the pension for European officials, and C, dealing with contingency liabilities. But I am interested in your views in first part, potential obligation budget process. And if my understanding there is disagreement between European Commission, which is headed by diplomat Maestro Michel Barnier, and vis-à-vis France and France and German government, would you able to share what are the key issues? How do you see these things you sorted out? Thank you.
I think I'm much more concerned about the pensions of future officials. I'm supposed to retire next year. So, no conflict of interest there. I used to say, sometimes when we're going through difficult times in Brussels, I used to remind my colleagues in the European Public Service that there was still an office in Geneva paying out the pensions of retired League of Nations officials well into the 90s. So the endurance of public sector pensions is highly commendable. No, look, I can't comment on the details of the negotiation because I'm not privy to the sort of inner reflections in Brussels at the present time. It is going to be a difficult discussion. It's horrendously complicated. The extraction of the United Kingdom from the European Union, 45 years of intimate interaction, regulatory, commercial, business, legal. It's going to be very complicated. And there are going to be some difficult issues, of which the one you mentioned, the sort of financial liabilities. We're just going to have to try and find a way through it, but it is not going to be easy. It's complex, it's technically difficult, and it's politically, of course, very sensitive, as we know, particularly in the United Kingdom, but also for the rest of us. I mean, the focus sometimes, I think, is on the UK having decided to leave, but the UK decision to leave creates enormous problems for the rest of us. It's not a sort of a purely autonomous action of the United Kingdom for its own choice. It has impacts on their immediate neighbours. I'm Irish. The problem it creates in Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland, the success of the peace process in Ireland was largely based on joint membership of the European Union. So how do we now ensure that process is not disrupted by this decision to leave? The trading relations and other relations with the rest of the continent, the large numbers of European, non-UK European citizens who are living in the United Kingdom. So, I mean, this is going to be a very complicated discussion. I think we will all approach it with a degree of goodwill and some common sense, but there are going to be some tough issues. And I think the choice of Michel Barnier as the chief negotiator is an inspired one. I knew him well when he was a member of the European Commission, when he was in the Constitutional Convention, of course, French foreign minister. He knows the European Union very well. He knows the United Kingdom very well. But you know, we cannot avoid that at some point during these discussions there will be some very tough issues to be decided. I'm sure both sides will try to do it in the fairest and best way possible, but our interests will not always perfectly coincide, and we're going to have to manage that. But so I can't give an answer to your precise answer to your budgetary question, but it is you know, one of the many complex and difficult issues that we're going to have to find solutions for.
Thanks very much. Michael Mosadig in the third row here.
Mike Mosadig, journalist. Very brief preamble. As someone with Central European antecedents, I appreciate your comments about the moral duty of optimism. But I'm also reminded that one of our more famous Irish Americans, Senator Moynihan, once said that there's no point in being Irish unless you understand that someday the world is going to break your heart. My question is very brief. Is TTIP still alive or is it dead?
Well, the other quote I could give you is, I think it was Ernest Hemingway who said of F. Scott Fitzgerald, what I despise is his cheap Irish love of failure. Yeah. So, look, TTIP is neither alive nor dead. It's paused for the moment. The negotiations continued up to the end of last year. The new administration is not in place. We don't have a confirmed USTR. Future Ambassador Lighthizer, I gather, you know, until such time as he's confirmed, Secretary Ross is not yet confirmed, so we don't quite know. For the moment, we can't actually talk to anyone, have a conversation with the administration about how they would like to go forward. We stand ready to continue the discussions if that is the wish of this administration. If that is not their wish, we will listen to what they have to say. Meanwhile, we have a hugely busy trade agenda. Cecilia Malmström, our chief trade negotiator, is actively negotiating with Japan, with Mexico. We just concluded last week, and I hope this did not go unnoticed here, a very ambitious trade deal with Canada, one of the most ambitious trade deals ever concluded between members of the OECD world, if I can use that phrase. And something which, by the way, you know, when people were saying, oh, you know, trade deals are also unpopular in Europe, it went through with a very large majority in the European Parliament and the unanimous agreement of all 28 member states. So it shows that Europe is still very much open for business, for well-balanced and well-crafted trade deals. We continue to think that the logic which led us to launch the negotiations, the enormous degree of economic interpenetration across the transatlantic economic corridor, which is the busiest economic corridor in the world, bar none. I mean, there is nothing that compares for either of us to our relationship with each other. Our relationship with Asia, and I'm a big fan of Asia. I lived in Japan. I love Asia. It's a great continent. But none of us have the degree of relations with Asia that we have with each other. So we think that it would make sense to continue those negotiations, but frankly, this is entirely in the hands of the new administration, and we don't know what their considered view on the issue is, and we will wait to hear what they have to say when the relevant members of the cabinet have been confirmed and have had a chance to sort of sit behind the desk and take stock of the files that they face.
Thank you very much for that good answer. Let me follow up the question about the Iran deal. I was very pleased that High Representative Mogherini was reassured of continuing U.S. support for the deal. I wonder if you have any sense of what this means in practice. For example, in either April or May, the current waiver on U.S. sanctions on Iran expire. And no, the signals from the White House don't suggest to me that the waiver will be extended. Maybe they will, but I hope they will. But if they're not, U.S. sanctions kick back in, and the question in my mind, how Iran responds is not predetermined. It might depend on how much continued trade and investment from Europe Iran can enjoy, even if they don't get the benefits of U.S. sanctions relief. Can you foresee that the European Union as an entity or individual member states might try to reinforce the Iran deal by giving reassurances, maybe legal reassurances to European firms that even if they get sanctioned by the United States under secondary sanctions measures, that they would be indemnified by their governments? A bit of a technical question here, but I just don't know what it means when U.S. Reassures Europe of continuing support, and yet the political signals all seem to be negative.
Well, I think those of us living in Washington these days have to get used to a situation where an incoming administration is settling in, perhaps to slightly conflicting messages coming from different bits of the administration at different moments. I think on many issues there is not yet a fully settled and fully worked out policy on issues. So it's not surprising that you sometimes hear, I don't know if they're contradictory, but more nuanced views depending on who is speaking. I think on the Iran deal, I mean, what Federica Mogherini said when she was here was, this is an international deal. It's not a bilateral deal. It's not a European deal. It's not an American. It's an international deal, signed up to, negotiated by a certain group of the international community: the United States, the European Union, and our 3 member states: France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, and Russia and China. But I mean, ultimately endorsed in the United Nations and embraced by the international community. She is responsible for implementing that deal. And she has said very clearly that she believes it must be implemented rigorously. That includes that Iran has to live up to all its commitments and all the monitoring obligations and all the decommissioning of material and so forth, with the International Atomic Energy experts acting as the sort of guarantors of that. And she will be very tough on all parties. But that also includes on those of us who had to give up, who agreed to give up sanctions directly linked to that Iran deal. And I think she expects and assumes that everyone will do what they signed up to do. And I think that's the basis on which we are going forward. Now, if there are other sanctions, if there are other issues, unhappiness with other aspects of Iran's policies and the decisions to, in a way which is clearly not linked to anything which would be incompatible with our commitments under the deal, that's a separate discussion. We have to have that discussion internally, but also with Iran. One thing is very clear, is that the expectation of Iran in agreeing to this deal was that the lifting of sanctions would have a real economic consequence for their country. I mean, I think that was a legitimate expectation. And I think anything which sought to frustrate that could be perceived as being not living up to the respect of the deal. And we are trying, working very hard to make sure that any possible conflict between the sanctions which were lifted and sanctions which remain, and that working very well with the U.S. authorities on that to minimize the risk that sanctions intended for some other purpose could frustrate legitimate commerce and trade, which would be permitted under the nuclear deal. But I think our general position is one of rigorous respect of all commitments entered into under that deal by everyone who signed up to it. And that starts with Iran, of course, but it includes the rest of us who also signed up to take certain actions in return for what Iran will do.
Thank you, and I hope that message resonates where it needs to resonate in this capital. Stanley Roth, back here.
I want to draw you out a bit on EU-Turkish relations. And it's an area where I think there's often difference between the U.S. and European perspectives. Americans, I often hear from academics, pundits, retired diplomats say the EU really squandered an opportunity to pull Turkey into Europe, and now look what's happened. And maybe it's too late. The Europeans I speak to say, thank goodness we didn't. They never quite measured up to European standards, and what's going on just proves it. But I'm interested in your assessment. Is there still life in the possibility that Turkey could someday join the EU?
Yes, I think there is. Joining, we've never actually had an enlargement negotiation that failed, except with Norway, who twice concluded the negotiations and then at the last minute decided they were better off with a different arrangement. But in general, when we engage with accession negotiations, we try in good faith to bring them to a successful conclusion. What is very important, I think, for Americans to understand, and is that membership of the European Union, it's not like joining another international organization. You know, it's not like, and people sometimes say, oh, Turkey should join the EU. Well, yeah, but joining the EU is a heavy commitment on both sides, for them and for us. And that, to the point I was making to my Serbian ambassador colleague, it requires a country to sign up to fundamental commitments, which that country has to be willing to do. They have to accept the application on their territory of European law and the European Court of Justice and European human rights laws. And equally, we have to accept that that country will have a say over over our future. There would be, if Turkey were to join the European Union tomorrow morning, there would probably be more Turkish members of the European Parliament than there would be German members of the European Parliament. This is not a small thing. I'm not saying that that's not a reason Turkey should not join. I'm just saying that joining the European Union is a heavy commitment. And frankly, Turkey is an important country, but it's also a big country, and it's a relatively poor country. And there are also serious considerations about when Turkey would join, about the implications of the way in which certain of our policies work, whether it's agricultural policy or regional or structural funds. I mean, Turkey could potentially consume very large sums of money and be entitled to consume very large sums of money. So this would have implications for our budget. So it's not, it's not a simple, let's have them join, as some people, I think. There's a process involved. Now, it is also true that while this process has been ongoing, and by the way, we've also had the complication with Turkey of the Cyprus dispute. And frankly, until that is resolved, I think Turkish accession to the European Union is very difficult to imagine. It's very difficult to imagine that a country joins the European Union when it is still controversially occupying a part of an existing member state which is not recognized. I mean, that would have to be sorted out very clearly before you could move forward. So I think we are still committed to the process. We will go forward in good faith. It's taking time, and of course, as you implicit in your question is, while Turkey is not standing still while this process is happening, other things going on in Turkey, domestic changes in politics and so forth, which may take them down a slightly different path. I don't know. They also say they're still committed. So we have to see how this finally ends up. But I think the idea that somehow we could magically have flicked a switch 10 years ago and simply let Turkey in, as an afterthought, is completely to misunderstand what accession to the European Union actually means. It would be more like having Mexico join as the 51st state than it would be, simply even something like NAFTA. It's a very deep connection between countries' membership of the European Union, and I think the reality is that Turkey was probably not ready several years ago. The European Union was probably not ready. So we needed more time, and we will continue to need more time, but we are committed to the process. And as I say, our historical record is that when we've embarked on the process, it has always succeeded sooner or later. With Turkey, only time will tell.
Now we've got a couple more questions, so I'm going to take them two at once so we get them both. First, Ed, just over here, and then you, sir, right afterwards, if you don't mind taking two questions at once.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Edward F., Georgetown University. The criticism that we hear of the European Union here, and that we certainly heard in the Brexit debate, is frequently summarized by the sentence, those unelected bureaucrats in Brussels are, and what follows is frequently something that sounds absurd, like the size of cucumbers, how much curvature bananas are allowed to have, what is the definition of pasta, etc. I mean, how are we to understand that kind of criticism? Does that all make sense? Has Brussels gone too far? Are there small adjustments that could be made that would satisfy these more nationalistic objections? Thank you.
You know what? Why don't you go ahead and answer this, because the definition of pasta is just too important to dilute it with another question.
I get very angry when I hear that. Not from you, sir, but when I hear it. Nobody's unelected in Brussels. I mean, European public servants are not elected, but then your American civil servants are not elected. European Union functions on a democratic basis. No decisions are taken in Brussels other than with the assent of the representatives of the member states in the Council of Ministers and the directly elected European Parliament. That is the fact. Everything we do is through democratic accountability. Of course, we have institutions and we have structures and we have people who are appointed to positions because that's the way life works, but these people do not, these people implement decisions, these people execute all the fundamental, the European Commission has no power to take decisions, it makes proposals jointly to the member states meeting in the Council and the European Parliament, directly elected European Parliament, and they decide. So everything that people want to complain about has actually been decided by elected politicians, democratically elected politicians. And one of the things that frustrates me in the debate is it frequently suits the Eurosceptics to nationalize success and Europeanize failure. In other words, if something is a success in Europe, where frequently the impression will be created it was delivered nationally. If something goes wrong, they'll say it was Brussels. And unfortunately, there has been a temptation on the part of some national politicians to take the easy way out. You have to take some tough decisions in Brussels. You participate in that, taking that decision. You agree, yeah, we have to take this decision. But when you go back home, what you say is, oh, they decided in Brussels. There was nothing I could do. And if it was a good decision, you come back and say, well, it was great. I made sure that they took this great decision. And I think we're paying a price for that, frankly, of not being sufficiently honest with our citizens about the limits of national sovereignty and why it is that we need European-level rules in order to govern our living together on the European continent. And some of the examples you quote, and our office in London spent years busting these myths. Most of them were myths. But one of the most interesting ones was lawnmower noise. There was Eurosceptics in the UK made a big fuss about the fact that we had a regulation which dictated the noise of lawnmowers. Now, in fact, when you're selling European lawnmowers across the entire European Union, this was an issue because in most countries there are actually safety levels for it. But it turned out it was a British request. They asked because they feared unfair competition from German lawnmowers, which didn't have the same noise standards that they had. When you find anything that we've done, there's always a reason why someone has asked us to do it and why someone has said, in order to make the single market function, in order to be able to sell your products across borders, we need some common rules. Now, are there too many? Well, that depends a bit on your perspective. We have gone through, the current Commission has a big program of deregulation, of trying to roll back regulation, but I can assure you the strongest opponents are very often the member states who say, oh, no, we must keep that rule. We couldn't possibly change that rule. It's very important. So this is a debate. You're having it here. The new administration is going to do a rollback of regulation and constraints on business. And I'm sure you'll have the same debate, with some people saying, yes, we must get rid of these unnecessary constraints, and some people saying, oh, no, wait a minute, we need that rule for consumer safety, for health or environment concerns. This is a constant debate in any society, and the European Union is no different between how many rules you need in order to work together and to trade together, and whether some of those rules are excessive. But the point I really want to make is that nothing is decided in Brussels that is not democratically approved by elected representatives of our member states and of our citizens through the European Parliament. And that is the reality. So I do get quite upset when people talk about unelected bureaucrats in Brussels deciding things behind closed doors against the will of the people. And by the way, Brussels is the most transparent decision-making place in the world. The problem is we can't keep anything a secret, to be frank with you. It was sometimes my job to try and keep certain things confidential for a short period, and it was almost impossible. So very little happens behind closed doors. Everything happens in full public view and very democratically decided. So I really, this is a point on which you can dislike the European Union. You can say you want to leave, you prefer to go in your own way, but please do not tell me that it is not run on transparent and democratically accountable basis, because it is very strongly.
That animated answer might be a good place to end, but I did say I would recognize one last here. So, sir, you have the last question.
My name is Jared Lim from TechRo, representing Taiwan. Ambassador, thank you for your impressive presentation. I just have a quick question for the bilateral relations. Taiwan welcomes and are very grateful for the better relationship with the European Union along the years. And this better relationship starts with the waiver of the Schengen visa in 2011. And also the trade relations between two sides is, on the grow. And, in this context, we wish to sign a bilateral BIA as soon as possible with the European Union. And so, Ambassador, could you talk a little bit about the future prospect of the Taiwan-EU relations down the road? Thank you.
Well, I mean, as you know, we have a one China policy, and we have full respect for that. But we also greatly value our relationship with Taiwan. We've had good ongoing relations, including commercial relations, and I think that will continue. Whether we would have space or time for a future trade agreement, frankly, is something that's been discussed occasionally. But as I already said, we've got I think Cecilia Malmström has 20 ongoing trade negotiations. So I think the feeling is maybe we need to finish some of those before we start too many new ones. But we value the relationship. We have a good partnership, and I hope that will continue.
Well, thank you, Ambassador O'Sullivan. You've answered all questions in detail with frankness. You've gone beyond the EU-US relationship to address every global issue that's been put to you, and you address it well. You give us a sense of inspiration. You give us food for thought. You give me food for tweeting. And please join me in thanking the Ambassador for all of this.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you.